what difference does it make? If I believe in Jesus Christ as my Savior, why do I care how God brought about what we see around us? So I'll give you 4 examples of the problem with evolutionists. Bertrand Russell, he was a philosopher and mathematician. He says mankind is a curious accident in a backwater. And Peter Atkins, another professor in the UK, mankind's just a bit of slime on the planet. And Stephen Jay Gould, who was a professor at Harvard, mankind is a fortuitous cosmic afterthought on the book of life, on the bush of life. And then Richard Dawkins, he's the only one of these 4 that's still alive, a very anti-Christian, outspoken atheist. He says, we live in a universe which has no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Men and women, according to these people, are basically a bag of chemicals. That's all we are. So when you start with the foundation of evolution and realize, of course, that that's not the only cause of evil in our society. Genesis 6:5 says, the thoughts and the intents of the heart were evil all the time. And it hasn't changed. Immediately after the flood, sin comes roaring back. But evolution has been around for 170, 80 years, 180 years. And a lot of the problems that we see in our culture are a result of the fact that people do not have any moral foundation. In contrast, if we start with biblical creation, I'm going to ask you in a moment why I put biblical creation below God's word. Brad, you would certainly emphasize the importance of God's word, wouldn't you? So why did I put biblical creation? Think about it. I'm going to ask you that question. But in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, we find in fact, we find the whole of the Bible in seed form in the first 11 chapters. We're told how everything came into existence. We are told about male-female marriage. We have the rule of law in that Adam and Eve were told not to eat from a particular tree. Of course, the introduction of sin. But we have the gospel in Genesis 3:15. We have a purpose for life in Genesis 1:26. Mankind was given dominion over the creatures. So a lot of stuff there, right there in Genesis 1-11. Now you'll see as we go along some other examples. Why did I put biblical creation below God's word? Oh, you can't answer. No, that's like a shill in the audience. All right, Brad, why?
Well, not everyone has God's word, but everyone can see.
That's a good answer, actually. The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament is magnificent, right? From Psalm 19? Yeah. That's a good answer. I'd give a slightly different one, if I may. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Somebody tell me. 1. God created. The very first thing God tells us about himself, the very first thing is he's a creator. Genesis 1:3. What happens there? And he said, let there be light. Second thing he tells us about his personality, his character, is he's a communicator. First and foremost, God declares himself to be a creator. From Genesis 1:1 right to Revelation, you are worthy, O God, to receive glory and honor. Why? Because you created all things. In Isaiah and in Jeremiah, God defends himself against the pagan gods because he's the creator. In the Psalms, Psalm 104, Psalm 19, and so on, God defends himself as the creator. One more example. The book of Job. It is actually the oldest book of the Bible. It was written approximately 2200 BC. When Moses put together the Pentateuch, it was about 700 years later, around 1500 BC. And what do we find in these challenges of Job's supposed friends is that after a while, God gets a bit tired of their going back and forth. He intervenes and he says, what? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? I am the creator. That's what he says. So cover to cover, God declares himself to be the creator. Now, I'm sure everybody here would say in some form or another, yeah, I believe that God created. Would you some way, right? But many of the people would also say, I have a Christian worldview, like I'm against medical assistance in dying or against abortion and those kinds of things. The problem that we deal with constantly at CMI is we find people that are injecting into this a wedge. One of them is the idea that the earth is 4.5 billion years old, the universe 13.8 billion years old, and that God used some form of evolution to bring about the variety. And the problem is with that is that when young people have been brought up in the church and they haven't been fortified, vaccinated against the evolution, the result is that they often leave the church because they're not prepared for the onslaught, particularly if they go to secular university. Well, even many so-called Christian universities are pushing theistic evolution. But one chaplain at a U.S. university indicated that when young people come in first year, many of them will say that they believe in God, but the number drops dramatically by second year. Something is challenging them, and they're not able to give the answers. I don't have any of them with me, but we have a DVD called Fallout, and it basically interviewing young people and trying to understand why they've left the church. And the primary reason that they give is they aren't getting an answer to the questions of evolution in their churches. Our mission at CMI is to churches primarily. That's what we focus on. So these are the kinds of questions that Christians will have. And I'm not going to read these, but they just give you some idea, like where do dinos fit into the Bible, as an example. If you're interested, tonight we're going to deal with dinos and man and how they fit into the Bible and into the Ice Age and so on. So we'll look at that this evening. And it is family-oriented, the dino talk. So keep that in mind. So little kids will actually get something out of it if they're here. So there are many professing Christians. In their hearts, they believe in Jesus as their Savior, but at the same time, they have nagging doubts because of the constant bombardment of the secular media about evolution. When I began getting interested in this topic, I was in high school, and somebody invited me to attend a lecture by a man named Whitcomb, and he, with another man named Morris, published a book called The Genesis Flood, which was a seminal work in this space. And since then, the amount of information that has become available to us to support biblical creation and to show the challenges with evolution is overwhelming. In fact, much of it has only become available in the past 20 to 25 years. And really, emphatically, I can tell you right now that it is a great time to be a Christian because the science supports the Bible. It is that simple, not evolution. So what I'd like to do is go through some topics, high-level topics with you to consider where science supports the Bible. Obviously, I can't go into great depth, and for each of the topics we're going to look at, I have 1-hour presentations. I have a total of 14 presentations, so we could be here for a week. But I need to define evolution because I've used the term, and you may have over the years heard different definitions of evolution. So what I want to do is give you an evolutionist definition of evolution. That's where we should start. Let's understand what their view is. So they would claim that all of life came from a single original cell that could reproduce, that could eat, breathe, move, and so on. All of life came from that. Couldn't have been a virus. Why couldn't it have been a virus? Sorry? Yeah, they need other life to exist in, so they need a host. So it can't be a virus. Maybe an amoeba or a bacteria. So let's assume that, for the sake of discussion, it was like a bacteria. The simplest bacteria that scientists know about which can do all those things that we would call life, and I put that in quotes because it's not the Hebrew definition of living creatures, nefesh kaya, but what they would call life, has roughly 480 genes. 480 genes. That amount of information is needed for life. Over time, the genetic information has been increasing and increasing, they claim, through two mechanisms, natural selection and mutation. More and more information is being added through time. And at the present, all the leaves are all the species and plants, every types of bacteria and everything that's out there. And then some of the leaves are extinct. They're in the fossil record, or they went extinct during the Ice Age or whatever. They're extinct, and even going extinct in modern times. So some of the leaves have gone extinct. There are the branches in this supposed tree of life where there is no evidence of any life form. For example, nothing in the fossils, nothing in the... And this is the missing links. That's not a term creationists have invented. Evolutionists use that term. So evolution is increasing information in the genetic makeup of creatures. Lynn Margulis, she's no longer alive. She was a prominent, outspoken evolutionist. Listen to her definition. Every form of life on Earth, oak tree and elephant, bird and bacterium, shares a common ancestry. If you get nothing else out of this presentation, although I think there's something else later that you're going to remember more easily, but if you get nothing else out of this presentation, get the understanding that it's increasing the amount of information through time. That's what evolution is, according to evolutionists. This is not evolution. This, when you breed dogs and they become highly specialized, they become less robust. If you want a very robust dog, what do you want? What do you want if you want a very robust dog? A mix. I like to use the word a mutt. You want a mixed, right? Because you're bringing more of the genetic spectrum together and you're going to get a robustness. One of my sons is married to a Chinese girl, and I say, Charles has the best genetics because he's brought two completely different sets of genetics together. And you know what happened, say, in the European royal family when they would marry cousins and things over the years? There was always genetic problems. It's much better to have the variety. Dog breeding removes genetic information. It's a decrease, not an increase. Similarly, this plant, a tea plant found in China, is caffeine-free. Why do plants have caffeine? Coffee, tea, cocoa plants, others have caffeine. Why? Yeah, you're an expert in this. Oh, yes. It's a pesticide. Did you have, you have a tea or coffee there? You're drinking a pesticide. But just so you know, I had a cup of tea, a strong cup of tea this morning, right? But we drink a pesticide. But we drink it normally in such low quantities that it doesn't poison us. But I do believe that someday having a naturally decaffeinated tea will find it quite cool. Because people like me who are hyperactive, we want to have decaffeinated before we go to bed, right? But this plant is going to take a while to breed enough of it so that they can harvest them, and it takes about 7 years for a tea plant to reach maturity so that you can start taking the leaves. So we have an interesting statement here. When the economists wrote about this, they say this tea has lost the ability to produce an enzyme that synthesizes caffeine. But notice they use the word evolution. This isn't evolution. It's a loss of genetic information. It's devolution, devolving. And this you will see in the popular literature all the time, a misuse of the term evolution. They'll talk about genetic drift or sharing genetic information. That information's already there. It's not increasing the amount of information. So we declare that God created, based upon his word, in 6 natural days that followed one right after the other, and he did this about 6,000 years ago. At that point, often people's heads explode because they say, how can you believe that the universe is only 6,000 years old? I was speaking up at north of Toronto a few years ago, and there was a young man who, during the Q&A period afterwards, man, did he want to tackle me on the 6,000 years. He's first year at U of T, and you know, first year university students think they're the smartest people on the face of the earth, right? So keep that 6,000 in mind as we go along. What I'd like to do is give you 5 quick reasons for why we should believe in biblical creation. First, we're going to look at is Genesis 1 is history. And surprisingly, I'm going to spend the most time on this, because if we don't get this right, we may as well close our Bibles, in my opinion. Second, death is a result of Adam's sin, very briefly, but we'll look at that, and it's important. I want to just do a quick sweep through some biological challenges that evolutionists have no answers to. And third, a few pieces of evidence that the world is not billions of years old. I have a complete presentation on the age of the earth, and I also have one on cosmology and the age of the universe and the Big Bang and all that. But I'm just going to give you a few snippets here. And then finally, a few pieces of information to support why we believe in the Genesis flood. So when we start getting to the blue and the red arrows, you'll know that lunch isn't too far off. On the left-hand side is the sequence of the evolutionists. There was a supposed Big Bang. And by the way, if you read Stephen Hawking's book, A Brief History in Time, and Carl Sagan's introduction there, they both posit the opinion that there was nothing, and then there was a quantum ripple. There was nothing, and then there was something out of nothing. I mean, put your thinking hats on, folks. But they go through a long sequence, and they need billions of years in order to have this. I was speaking in Vernon at a Christian school. The entire school was there, and I spoke in the morning, and their science teacher had prepared them. They came with clipboards full of questions to hit me with. It was a lot of fun, actually. But one of the kids asked me, why is it that unbelievers believe in evolution? Right? Why is it? And it's a good question, isn't it? But one of the reasons why they need this long ages, they need time for evolution to occur in their thinking, because it happens, it's not observable, and it's so slow. So this sequence supposedly gives them billions of years of time. The right-hand sequence comes right out of Genesis 1, and you cannot line these up. You can see how they cross over. In fact, there's one highly significant contradiction in here that blows the whole thing apart. Do you know what it is? What was created on day 3 in the Genesis account? And Brad and Bob cannot answer. And Chris can't answer. No. Chris, what was created on day 3? Right. Oh, no, not on day 3. Sorry? No. Huh? No. Wow, no, plant life. What was created on day 4? The heavens, the stars, moon, and all that. Do you see what God has done here? He's put plant life before the sun. So we have a basic problem of logic is presented to us here. It is called the law of non-contradiction. You cannot have two concepts that contradict one another and both be right, unless you're a Buddhist, because they can hold conflicting ideas, right? But one of these must be wrong. One of them, at least one of them, must be wrong. It's that simple. So various theories have been presented attempting to rationalize these two, a gap hypothesis, day-age view, overlapping days, framework hypothesis, and on and on and on. And one that just cracks me up is somebody is saying it's not talking about creation at all, that heavens and the earth and everything, but it's talking about the formation of the land of Israel. Yeah. So, but one of the theories is that Genesis 1 is poetry. So let's just examine that. The natural reading of the text is its narrative. In fact, Stephen Boyd, who did work in Hebrew, he did a statistical analysis of the verb forms that are used in poetry, Book of Psalms, Song of Solomon, and the verb forms that are used in narrative, 1st and 2nd Samuel, that kind of thing. And overwhelmingly, the verb forms that are in Genesis 1 is so statistically significant. They are narrative verb forms. And then it's presented as part of a historical chronology that goes right up to Abram without a gap, and it just tells us what God did. And God tells us in the account he handed to Adam, because God was the only one who was there to see it, and he told Adam, Adam handed it down through Methuselah to Shem to Abraham. They overlapped. So whether it was in written form or oral form, it only went through 2 generations until it reached Abram. And he tells us that he created in 6 days to set a pattern for our week. Why do we have a 7-day week? You go and look at the secular literature and they'll scramble to tell you why. We have 10 digits. The objects in the solar system are more than 7. Why a 7-day week? God instituted. Every society on earth uses a 7-day week. There have been attempts to eliminate it in modern times during the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and Mao in China all tried to get rid of the 7-day week, and they failed. We need a day of rest. It is that simple. We also have a form in Hebrew called the consecutive and. And when you see and in a sequence of events, it indicates that they occur in a tempo following one right after another. And that's a standard way that Hebrew thinking is. There's also the use of the ordinal in the Genesis 1 account. Now, day 1 is cardinal, day 1, whereas the others are 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and 6th. That, when you go to Numbers 7 and Numbers 29, when the offerings are being presented, the ordinal is used for all the days. Not a theologian on the face of the earth will tell you that Numbers 7 and Numbers 29 are not natural days. And yet they try to impose in Genesis 1 and say, no, they can't be natural days. But God tells us they're natural days. Each day has an evening and a morning. We use Roman reckoning and we say morning and evening. Why did God say evening and morning? That's a tough one, eh? Why evening and morning? Well, very simple. He created the earth, and it was already a spinning ball, and there was darkness. Then he created light, evening and morning, as it rotated out of evening into light. So evening came before morning in the created order. And he tells us that there are natural days. He couldn't have said 24 hours. 24 hours is a post-flood artifact, and there's debates of whether it was Sumerian, Babylonian, or Egyptian. Doesn't matter. God tells us it was an evening and a morning. And in the midst of the 10 Commandments, God declares what he did, and he said, therefore you have a week, and you should take a day of rest. And then Jesus places mankind's creation at the very beginning. Now, I had one little kid come up to me afterwards. Man, sometimes kids are so smart. He came up to me afterwards. He said, Mr. Hughes, you lied. What? And then he said, Adam wasn't created at the beginning. He was created on day 6. Right, okay. He's actually a very astute little kid. But the Bible treats Genesis 1 as history. For example, in Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews, which I believe is Paul, but the writer of Hebrews says, by faith we understand the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. God tells us that some of the things he created were made out of things like visible, like Adam out of the dust and Eve out of a rib. But the point Paul is making, or the writer of Hebrews, it is making here is that God created things instantly out of nothing. That's what God did. And they came into existence. It seems to me that you can't be any more plain than God has made it in Genesis 1. This is what I did. It's that simple. And as I said at the beginning, if we do not accept this, why should we accept the virgin conception? Why should we accept the resurrection? If we can't take God's word, what he says in Genesis 1, why accept it anywhere else? It's that simple. Now, I do believe that there are absolutely I can't call them Bible believe. I believe they are Christians, they are converted, but they're not accepting the plain sense of Genesis 1. And we need to. Second, I said I would spend the most time on that topic because it's absolutely fundamental. Second topic, death was introduced by Adam's sin. At the end of the creation week, God saw everything that he made, and he declared it to be all very good. And yet, if there's been 540 million years going from the Cambrian to the Precambrian all the way up of supposed evolution, then we find in the fossil record death and disease and carnivorism and decay. Is that very good? I don't know what the word good means. So it was Adam's sin that brought a curse, not just on humans, but on animals and on the thorns and thistles, and we read about that in Genesis 3. The earth was cursed, and it is decaying through time. So every single fossil must have been formed after Adam's sin. So right away, this puts a big problem into long age cosmology, because we have man before fossils. And of course, we contend that most of the fossils were created during the flood, some possibly during the Ice Age. Paul makes an interesting analogy, and Bob, I'll let you do the analogy because you did it yesterday, right? About Christ and Adam, right?
Can be no
Last Adam if there's no first Adam, right? We were talking about that last night. He makes this analogy, that is, that it was a historic Adam, an Adam who sinned, who brought death and decay. And we need that if we're going to have a historic Christ who, through his death and resurrection, conquered sin. The two sides of that analogy have to be there. And you see it so strongly in 1 Corinthians 15. That has to be there. If you want to pursue this topic further, we have had a TV program for a decade, and this episode, I think, was in season 9, maybe it was in season 10. We've retired. We're not going to do any more seasons because we're approaching videos. People don't have the tolerance to watch a half-hour video anymore. So our videos are now a lot shorter that we're putting out, like 5 minutes, that kind of thing. But I wrote the script for this one, so I'm very partial to this one. So if you want to cover this topic, go, and I won't take your time right now, and I'll explain that animals, nefesh kai, living creatures that are described for the land-based creatures, the birds and humans, are cursed with death. So you can look at that. Third topic, quick sweep through some challenges that evolutionists have. I'm not going to deal with the topic of what's called abiogenesis here. I actually presented that as a second presentation yesterday morning at a church I was in Barriere. But what I want to do is assume that the molecules of life somehow came into existence. How do we get there? So just briefly, this is from Popular Mechanics. This isn't a Christian publication. Scientists are still waiting for proof that chemical ingredients can spontaneously assemble themselves, become wrapped in a membrane, and divide. In other words, there's still, notice the word, missing link between the chemistry of early life and subsequent biology. Here's another example, one of scientists' most enduring mysteries, namely how life sprung from non-living matter. So, That's a problem. Let's assume, though, that the building blocks of life are there. God uses a very fancy alphabet to create life. In computers, I worked in the computer industry for over 40 years, writing a lot of different software all the way from COBOL and Fortran to most recently Java, and managing large IT projects and that kind of stuff. So I have a lot of experience with software. It's not the hardware that is the problem. It's the software that is the problem. Even if we had the building blocks of life there, which are what are called nucleotides that make up DNA. A nucleotide is made up of three subcomponents in the molecule: a phosphate, a sugar, and a nitrogen group. The sugars will vary, and there are four of these in basically four nucleotides in the sugar vary. Did you know that every single nucleotide in every single cell of your body has sugar in it? You're all made of sugar. Isn't that cool? So these four building blocks have got to be assembled. Huh? These four building blocks have to now spell out words, sentences, paragraphs, and whole chapters in the DNA. Do you know how many? This is a rhetorical question. How many of these nucleotides are you going to have to string together to get the human genome? 3 billion of them. And you would have to string them together. If you could string them together one every second, it would take you over 100 years. That's the problem. It's not the hardware, it's the software. And Paul Davies, a physicist, he said, how did nature fabricate the world's first digital information processor, the original living cell from the blind chaos of blundering molecules? How did molecular hardware get to write its own software? I'll make you a challenge, a wager. I do not gamble, but I know I can't lose this one. I'll make you a wager. If you bring me your cell phone, your tablet, your computer, and say, look, it just wrote its own app, I will pay you $1 million. We know that hardware does not write software. And yet biologists have taken their thinking hats off and said, no, but in the biological world, hardware writes software. But we know that that doesn't happen. DNA, we only began discovering this recently, in fact, in the last 20 years, the amazing complexity of DNA. Do you know that DNA can be read in both directions? If you unzip it and create the messenger RNA and send it over to the factory to create the proteins, you get different messages that have to be assembled. Try to write a sentence that will work in both directions. Can you think like a single word that can be read in both directions? Race car, right? My favorite two, they're called palindromes. Now, the first one, as you hear, will initially sound risque, but as soon as I finish, you will realize I'm coming from. The most beautiful woman that you can imagine was coming up absolutely naked, and a young man went up to her and said, Madam, I'm Adam. Because they were naked before the fall, right? And he went up and he was asleep when she was created. So he went up and introduced himself, and then he named her Eve. Another example is, able was I, ere I saw Elba, when Napoleon went into exile. You try to write something that can be read in both directions and have meaning, even if it's not a perfect palindrome. Try to write something. God, in DNA, different proteins going in which direction you do it. There's epigenetic information. Back in the 1970s, when they were starting to decode DNA, they called this stuff junk DNA between the genes. No longer do they use the term junk DNA. Now they realize there's all kinds of error correction utilities and programming information built in between the genes. The genes are used to generate the proteins, but something's got to be controlling all this. And it's called epigenetic. I'll give you one example of the power of epigenetic information built into the DNA. DNA can actually reprogram in real time the development of a living entity. If a woman were to conceive and up in the highest altitudes of the Andes or the Himalayas, the developing fetus somehow senses atmospheric pressure, and the DNA starts to make changes in the formation of that body, and the child is going to be born with extra large lung capacity. Like, that's built into the DNA, and it can reprogram the development of that child. I could go on, I won't go anymore, too much detail. If there's anything out there that says made by God, it is DNA. Ask an evolutionist, biologist, how did cells get nucleuses? They have a theory called cell capture. One cell captured another. But how did it get a nucleus? And we have nuclear DNA in that nucleus. No empirical evidence of how it occurred. Let's take it up a level. How did multicellular entities, we are multicellular entities, come into existence? When a sperm and a egg come together, a new cell is formed, and then it begins to divide. And somewhere in that process, cells differentiate. And in the human body, there are roughly 250 different kinds of cells. How did cells learn to become multicellular? But not even that. How do cells learn to communicate with one another? If you cut your finger, immediately electrical and chemical signals fire, and the body says, guys, I need some coagulant over here, send it right away. And then in a few seconds later, okay, we stopped the bleeding. Now I need a subdermal cells, and we start building that. Now I need some skin cells. And how did cells learn to talk to one another? They can't explain this, evolutionists can't. Let's take it up a level. When an amoeba splits its chromosomes and duplicates, that's called asexual reproduction. When you have sexual reproduction, you're bringing two sets of genetic information together. In humans, there are 23 chromosomes. One set comes from our mother, one set comes from our father. And by the way, DNA programming, if you're building a new cell to replace our body cells, for example, it knows if there's an error in one of those chromosomes, and it will take the correct one most of the time, because it will actually do error checking. How did two sets of chromosomes start working together to create sexual reproduction? But let's put it more anatomically, and I'll use a euphemism here. If a male entity were to come into existence spontaneously, we would have had to have at the exact same time, in the same place, an entity that was a female, or you're not going to get sexual reproduction. How does this occur by chance? Well, the Bible actually tells us the answer, doesn't it? God made them male and female by their kinds, not the 37 different supposed genders or whatever you see on Facebook. The Darwin, when he wrote his book on the origin of species, he published in 1859, he indicated, as it says here, if it could be demonstrated any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Darwin didn't know anything about DNA. Watson and Crick were doing the X-raying of DNA structures 100 years later, in the 1950s. And what we know about DNA has only become available in the last 20 or so years, like the amazing features in DNA. He didn't know anything about genetics. Mendel was doing his work in his monastery in Germany, cultivating peas and working out how genetics work. He published 5 years after his paper, 5 years after Darwin published. Nobody paid any attention to genetics until about 1900. We know how important genetics are these days, using to solve cold case crimes, for example. People want to know their ancestry. We were even talking about that this morning, weren't we? People doing genetics to find out where they're descended from and all this kind of stuff. And making corrections to the genetics to remove a genetic disease using this technology called CRISPR. So there's a lot of stuff going on with genetics, and nobody knew anything about it until 1900. And then Darwin knew nothing about the complexity of cells. In his day, they believed that a cell was just an amorphous mass of protoplasm. To be blunt, Darwin was ignorant. And this is where we have the foundation of how life came into existence. This is an example of a very complex machine, which is both a propeller and a rudder in an E. coli bacteria. And you need the different colors on the right-hand side, or the different proteins. You need all of that there, or that bacteria is going absolutely nowhere. So it has to be assembled in the factory. It cannot come together through slight modifications. And there have been amazing publications in the last 20, 25 years showing example after example of what are called irreducibly complex systems that will not work unless all the pieces are there. It couldn't have been developed through slight incremental changes. Take it up a level. Anybody who grow tomatoes? Yeah. What do you need to have lots of tomatoes? Well, you're looking at the picture and you say, what do we need? Well, no, you don't need bees, because the bees that you think of are honeybees. And the honeybees actually came over with the European settlers. What you need is a bee that is native to the Americas, because tomatoes are native to the Americas. It's a symbiotic relationship. What bee do you need? You might be able to tell. Bumblebees. They are native to the Americas. And why? Because bumblebees hum they're the only bee that hums, and they hum at a perfect middle C. And when they hum, the little yellow flowers vibrate open like a tuning fork so that they can be pollinated. Sorry? Isn't that something? As I said earlier, this is the only thing you'll remember of my presentation. You'll never forget the bumblebee. So evolutionists cannot explain symbiotic relationships. They have a challenge here. If you need both parts there, how can tomatoes reproduce if they don't have bumble? By the way, where I live in Ontario, in Toronto, but up in the Bruce Peninsula, you may not know this, it's northwest of Toronto, is the largest nuclear plant in the world. They have 12 reactors up there. About 40% of Ontario's power is nuclear, and another 30% is hydro. So we're not worried about carbon stuff because most of it's either nuclear or hydro, right? But this is up there in that nuclear plant, rather than pumping the hot water back into that they use for the generators back into Lake Huron, they run it through pipes to heat greenhouses. And so we get fresh vegetables year-round. Greenhouse-grown tomatoes in our supermarkets that are grown in Ontario. And if you go to YouTube and look up how commercial greenhouses work, literally, in Canada Post, a cardboard box is shipped that has bumblebees in it. They open up a little trapdoor, and the bumblebees fly around the greenhouse, and they pollinate the tomatoes. You can go and see it on YouTube. It's really cool to see how this happens. One more example, origin of languages. Evolutionists will tell you that languages came from maybe out of Africa theory, and it was warnings and various grunts and groans that eventually evolved into complex languages. This is increasing information complexity. Remember my definition of evolution? Increasing information complexity. That's what they say. But languages are highly, highly complex structures, and older languages are more complex than newer languages. For example, if you take English as one example, English is made up of basically two components. The Anglo-Saxon component, like similar to German or Dutch, that kind of thing. And the other component was after 1066 with the Norman conquest, French came in. Well, English is a fairly new language. It developed in the 11th, 12th century, maybe by the time of Chaucer, that kind of thing. But an older language, French, and it's more complex than English, particularly if you've had to learn it in school. And then Even more complex is Latin, which is an older language, and Greek is an older language, and it's even more complex if you had to study at seminary. It's a lot of conjugations and cases and verb forms that we don't have in English. But if you go back even further, Sanskrit is a very old language, and it's even more complex. What's happening to languages? They're devolving. They're becoming less complex through time. Not adding information, losing information. Well, yeah, we added information from French, but that's not new information, it's lateral transfer. It's not creating new information. Well, there's also been a common vocabulary decline. At the time of William Shakespeare, it's estimated that the average native English speaker, let me back up. It's estimated that in William Shakespeare's corpus, he used about 60,000 words. If you had to study an original instance of one of his plays, you find words you don't know, right? And they have to put footnotes and tell you that it's this word or this word. The average native English speaker at the time of William Shakespeare could speak about 30,000 words. The average native English speaker today only works with about 15,000 words, half as many, and the average teenager only uses about 100 today. It used to be an attempt to find that common proto-language. They've given up on it now. They talk about 50 distinct families of languages, and you cannot get a common origin. Now, around 2200 BC, suddenly in the historical record, a whole bunch of languages appear, and many of them have written forms, hieroglyphics, symbolic runes, alphabets, and so on. Where did they come from? Well, again, Genesis 1 to 11 tells us that at the Tower of Babel, God suddenly created a whole bunch of languages to confuse their hubris of attempting to challenge him. You go to websites like Wikipedia and look at the origin languages, they'll never mention the Tower of Babel. And yet that's how they came about. And human language confirms the biblical account. Information is declining through time, not, like evolutionists say, increasing through time. The Earth isn't billions of years old. I mentioned nuclear DNA. There's also a ring of DNA in a mitochondria, which is a part of our cells. Not every one of our cell types has mitochondria, but most of them do. And in the mitochondria is basically the central processors for the cells. It also generates the electricity. It's called ATP inside the cells, but it's basically electricity because it's electron transfer. But it regulates what's going on in the factory inside of a cell. And there's a ring, not a double helix, inside the cell. And that ring of DNA we inherit only from our mothers. In nuclear DNA, you get 2 sets of chromosomes. In the mitochondrial DNA, and the difference is here we have 3 billion nucleotides. Here we have 16,600. So very easy to sequence compared with 3 billion. And the difference is there's 25,000 genes over here. In the mitochondria DNA, there's 37 genes. So it's very simple, comparatively, and yet it's controlling all the cell's factories with that amount of information in there. So interesting enough, we all have basically identical mitochondrial DNA. Our phenotypic differences come from our nuclear DNA. Many points are different. Hair color, eye color, skin color, body mass index, all that comes from our nuclear DNA, not our mitochondrial DNA. But you know, there are 3 sets of mitochondria DNA in the human population. Do you know why? Why are there 3 sets of mitochondria DNA? Genesis 1 to 11 tells us the wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Between Eve, and by the way, geneticists refer to mitochondria Eve. They don't believe in the biblical Eve, but The original source of human mitochondria came from Eve, but there were some mutations that were occurring after Adam and Eve sinned, down to the point of the flood. And so there were 3 female sets of mitochondrial DNA. So every one of us is descended from one of those 3 sets. But don't think that you can say, oh, I'm a Jephthite, a Hamite. You don't know which set belonged to which woman, right, and to which husband. So don't extrapolate that. But it's interesting, there are 3 basic strands, slight differences in the mitochondrial DNA across the human population. Studies were done looking at the Russian Romanov family and other long generational ones in this study, but I'll just use the Russian Romanov. That's the royal family of Russia. So I picture this as a scenario. It's not identical to what's in the article, but to keep it simple. Princess Katerina's hairbrush is found in the museum in St. Petersburg. And she or her maid were combing a little too harsh, and some of the hair came out with the follicles on the end. We can get the mitochondrial DNA from that hair. We know who her great-grandchildren are. Pluck a sample of hair there, compare the mitochondrial DNA, and we find some mutations have occurred over 6, 7 generations. And Gibbons, writing in Science, says evolutionary studies led them to expect one change in every 600 mutation in every 600 generations. So if they assume that Homo sapiens have been on the earth for 300,000 years, and you know how many mutations occur, you divide it into 300,000, that's where they get this. But they were stunned to find 10 base pair changes, which gave them a rate of 1 mutation every 40 generations. And she goes on and she says, the mitochondrial DNA change rate is too rapid to support evolution. The problem is that if we've been around for 300,000 years as humans, there should be a lot more mutations in our mitochondrial DNA. You know what she then says? And you can go look up this article. I can give you the reference. She says the measured rate indicates mankind's only been on the earth for 6,000 years. And then she says, but nobody believes that. Another problem that indicates that humans haven't been in the earth for, well, if you go back to Homo habilis, for example, we're talking 1.2 to 2 million years. Homo erectus, about 1 million, that kind of thing. It's ridiculous. The human genome is decaying. Mutations are overwhelmingly negative. There are some that are benign and possibly, but never demonstrated, some that are truly beneficial. Some of these mutations are very serious. In a paragraph, if you find a spelling mistake, you can probably interpret it and follow the instructions or whatever. But let's just say hypothetically, 3-letter word and the 2 nucleotides got switched. So instead of D-O-G, it's now G-O-D. Suddenly the meaning is quite different, isn't it? So some mutations are very deleterious and they accumulate in every generation. So you in the white sweater back there, you have a mutant sitting beside you, right? You knew that, right? So they're accumulating in every generation, roughly an additional 200 mutations added in each generation. Now, many of them are benign, but some of them are deleterious. Anybody lactose intolerant? Lactose intolerance is an example of a mutation that is deleterious. So it means you can't drink cow's milk unless the sugars have been broken down, right? The lactic sugars. So Sanford in his book, I don't have a copy of it here, but in my home inventory, I always carry it. But mutations are destroying the human population, and he predicts that in roughly 300 generations, the human population will go extinct. Where are we now? About 200 generations since Adam. Well, we don't have to worry about it. Christ will take care of it long before the human population goes extinct, and he will bring instantaneously, not in 6 days, instantaneously new heavens and an earth. So we don't have to worry about it. Mary Schweitzer, writing in the Smithsonian Magazine, was the first to put this forward, that she found blood samples and soft tissue and DNA in a T-Rex bone. After that was published, there was a hue and cry. How can there be soft tissue in T-Rex bones? They were buried 65 million years ago. We know that organic materials decay. Otherwise, we wouldn't have best before dates on our products. I've never seen one of 65 million years. And so here is an interesting, the presence of soft tissue indicates that these were buried during the flood 4,400 years ago, not 65 million years ago. Interesting, in Saskatchewan about 2 years ago, it was discovered soft tissue in a T-Rex that was unearthed there. Notice how the CBC reports this. For centuries, it's been thought that there's effectively no trace of biological tissue in the fossil, and there shouldn't be. And then the article goes on. It turns out the fossilization process isn't quite as straightforward, or maybe not as rapid as we thought it would be. They don't have an explanation, and this is a pure, outright waffle. That's what they're doing. Mary Schweitzer has gone on and published many more papers, at least, not her with that, but at least 50 distinct instances of soft tissue and blood and DNA and dinos and many more in other bones that have been discovered. And so these are examples of recent discoveries that indicate that evolution cannot be, because humans and dinos and everything can't have been on the earth for millions of years. One more example. The earth is a giant magnet, and a current is running around it, and that creates, as the electric current runs around it, makes a magnetosphere. And the magnetosphere protects us from cosmic rays coming in from the sun, which are neutrons that are completely isolated from an atom. And a neutron that is just basically a ball of energy, when it's isolated from an atom, has a half-life of about 10 minutes. And it takes 8.5 minutes to get from the sun to us. If they hit us, they can cause all kinds of damage. But they generally hit the atmosphere and the magnetosphere. They decay, and very few get through of these neutrons that are isolated from the body of an atom. If you look at a piece of clay pottery that was fired, say, 1000 AD, and it has, clay generally has pieces of iron in it, it became magnetic when it was fired, because when you have magnetic, and you can actually measure the magnetism of those pieces of iron in the clay. If you take a clay sample from the same location where that clay was fired and use the same firing techniques and do them after it's fired, use your magnetotron, in that 1,000-year period, the magnetism of those clay has declined by 40%. And if it continues at that rate, in less than 1,000 years, there will be no magnetic field left on this earth. We won't be able to go outside because we'll fry. And birds won't be able to navigate. Sea turtles won't be able to navigate. And do you know that dogs use the magnetic field to navigate as well? If you're interested in pursuing that, I wrote a paper on that, and it's on our website. But the scientists know our planet's protective shell isn't quite what it used to be. Over the past 2 centuries, this magnetic strength has taken a nosedive, and nobody has the foggiest idea why. That's not true. I know why. The Earth is decaying, and it's decaying rapidly. The Earth isn't old. It's just tired, and that's what Paul tells us. The whole creation is groaning, waiting for its redemption. And since it's not old, there certainly isn't time for evolution to have occurred. It is that simple. Quick sweep through some facts to support the biblical flood. Mass extinctions. During the flood time, there's all kinds of jumbling of fossils into lower sections as the sediment is building up. You try to find any single climatic or geological phenomenon today that can produce mass extinctions. Name one. 2 massive hurricanes hit Florida. Did they produce fossils? Do river deltas produce fossils? Where are the current processes? There are 0 that will produce the fossils like this. Only the flood can explain it. Worldwide sediment layers. If you line up Brazil and Africa, the sediment much of the way is the same. God splitting the continent apart, creating new ocean bases, and some additional sediment falls on. Worldwide sediment. There is a sediment layer that goes from the Appalachians up through eastern Canada, through Greenland, Iceland, Scotland, and into Scandinavia. Those were all adjacent to one another during the flood, and the continent was broken up. The Grand Canyon was not formed by the Colorado River. There were rounded rocks there that a 100-year flood could never have moved. This was a soft sediment at the end of the flood, and as that water is rushing down into the new forming ocean basins, they carved the canyon, and the Colorado River follows the path of least resistance. Mount St. Helens, 1980. All that ice and snow up there, plus when the volcano exploded and spewed out all that hot water, brought sludge and sediment washing down. And notice how it laid it down in layers. Within 5 years, that was hardening into rock. Rapid sediment deposition. You cannot explain over long ages how ripple marks, rain marks, footprints will be preserved. You can only explain it with the currents waving back and forth relatively gently as the water levels of the flood are increasing. You cannot explain how animals, so many animals, have been suddenly compressed and the soft tissue hasn't been able to rot away, but it has actually created an image in the sandstone or in the limestone. And so these had to have been encased in sediment so quickly that they didn't decay away. And if you look at canyons, razor thin layers, no evidence of erosion, no evidence of soil formation. You cannot explain that with those layers being laid down over millions of years. Tree trunks that run up through multiple layers of sediment, usually found where there was coal, and you can't explain this with current geological phenomena. There's at least 50 of these, what are called petrified forests around the world, where tree trunks run up through this. Hard rock cannot bend and twist. Soft sediment that hasn't yet hardened into rock will happen. You try to explain the current topography, the current geology of this earth without using the biblical flood, and you will have a difficulty. It is that simple. We have two really good books. Sadly, they've all sold. One is How Genesis Flood Shaped Our Earth, and the other is Geology 101. Geology 101 is written by Robert Carter and Michael Ord, and it's about a year old, and they're both very good. So, I've swept through at a very fast level. Some people refer to it as drinking from a fire hose, and a lot of information. You're not going to remember much of this. So we need to be prepared to give an answer for the hope that we have in us. And how are you going to do that? Well, you need to start to get into our material, and now we can pass around the blue clipboards that are at the back there, back row. If you would like to get on our mailing list, give us your email. Every Friday, we send out the latest articles, the new books, book deals, new videos, all kinds of stuff. It comes out every Friday. Every second week, it is a global mail out that goes into all of our global affiliates. We have offices in New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, South Africa, the United Kingdom, which covers Europe and Ireland, US and Canada. And we have a global mailing. And Allison and I do one of these a month as a global mailing. Allison's our marketing person in Kitchener, and we send out that one once a month. Australia does the other one once a month. And then on the alternate weeks, it's just a Canadian mailing. But every week we send out this. If you'd like to sign up, just fill in your email address. We have a really good book called Christianity for Skeptics, and it helps us to understand why Christianity is true when other religions are not. And it's very useful if you're working with co-workers and things like that are not believers, and you can help give good answers. Creation Answers book is our definitive work. We keep it very simple. We keep it right up to date. It's in its 10th edition, so we keep incorporating the latest science into it that supports the Bible and better examples. And if you got nothing else, this is the book to get, the Creation Answers book. It is a definitive work. It has about 66 questions. You don't have to read it cover to cover. Just go to the piece you're interested in. One lady somewhere in the past couple of days was asking me about radiometric dating. I had it DVDs. I don't have any of the books on it. Rocks Aren't Clocks, and I forget the other one. But I said, just read the piece in Creation Answers book. And she looked up in the index, and sure enough, it was there. Evolution's Achilles heel is dealing similar to what I did, sweeping through the challenges that evolutionists have, an accompanying DVD. Jonathan Sarfati, Genesis account, is a very good commentary. He is a PhD in chemistry and has a good theology background, and he brings the two together. And if you don't want to buy it, you can borrow Brad's. I don't have any. I had library starter kits with me, and they've all sold. It's a great deal, but they're all sold. So, and when you're last on the tour, you don't necessarily get all the products. Creation Magazine. Can we pass around the other clipboard? It has orange pages on them. Creation Magazine. We've been publishing this for almost 45 years. It's the longest going publication in the creation space. And it is a very effective tool, not only for keeping informed, but also for evangelism. I was in Alberta a couple of weeks ago, and a fellow there mentioned to me that he owns an apartment building. And we have a pack, you can buy 10 back issues, they're all different. And he puts them in the waiting room or the lobby in his apartment building. And he says they keep disappearing, which he's okay with. But we get testimonies about this magazine from people who have picked up a copy and they become a Christian by reading about it. And it's interesting because if you have anywhere like a doctor's office, a real estate office, a store that sells electronic equipment, you can put these in and let people pick these up. It is considered to be our number one. And by the way, it's very carefully peer reviewed. We work really, really hard to make sure that there's no factual errors in it. Check the facts. We only bill when we send it out. $7.50 a quarter. You get a hard copy first. And what's interesting, I bet you it costs close to $7 to mail it these days, right? So we haven't changed the price as long as I've been with CMI. And you get your hard copy, but you also get a free digital copy. Once you sign up for it, we send to your email the PDF version, and you can download it to your phone or tablet. But if you subscribe, filling in that form today, you can take one of the issues that are there, and you can take a DVD, and there's no charge for those. Here are some examples of articles from Creation Magazine that I have scanned. Tear off the bottom form, and make sure you fill in the back. We have one more children's pack left. I had a whole box of them when I started, and I have one pack left. And I only have one of the little kids' ones as well. So if you want those, you're going to have to grab them quick. Creation Answers book for kids. I think I have 2 copies of that left, I think. Genesis Academy, great for like a men's breakfast study and that kind of thing. And there's an instructor guide for each of the DVDs. You play the videos, and then you have a discussion guided by that. But you don't have to spend anything. We have a website that's got a huge amount of resources, from articles to videos and sales and all kinds of stuff. And you just go to creation.com. If you can't remember creation.com, just remember, in the beginning, God created creation.com. Right? We also have all kinds of visual and audio media, podcasts and various things on different channels. I have to admit, I don't know what some of these are. Allison keeps track of them all. She's a tremendous marketing resource. She's a very nice young lady. She just got married about a year ago. But what's interesting, I help her with some of this. But I was looking at some of the podcasts, and I said, wow, look, there's a podcast about Nimrod. And I started listening to it, and I realized he was reading my article about Nimrod. So I guess he picks up articles and then reads them into the podcast. That was cool. We have a problem in the broader church, in the seminaries, in the Christian universities. Many times they're undermining a support for belief in Genesis 1 to 11, and particularly Genesis 1. We need to get everything lined up. Our objective at CMI is to get everybody in the Christian church working together to challenge evolution. So, thank you very much. And I think we hand it over. Yeah.